Good morning and Chag Sameach. On Sukkot, we have 3 mitzvot that we are to fulfill. Mitzvah number 1 is lulav and etrog. Mitzvah number 2 is to be happy. Zman simchatenu, the day of our great joy, the days of our great joy. This is the time when we are required and obligated to be happy and joyous. And of course, the third and final mitzvah is to sit in the sukkah. So that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit today. Earlier this morning in our Torah reading, Lou read for us this verse. You shall dwell in Sukkot for 7 days, so that your descendants will know that I settled the children of Israel in Sukkot when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. Besukkot teshvu shivat yamim, Laman yedu dorotechem ki besukot hoshafti et bnei Yisrael. But there's an inherent problem with this line that we read this morning on Sukkot. Nowhere else does it say in our Torah that our ancestors actually lived in Sukkot. Where did they live? In tents. Ma tovu halecha Yaakov, how great are your tents, O Jacob, right? We read over and over again about tents. Now, if you go camping out in the woods, in the rain, would you prefer to live in a tent or in a sukkah? In a tent, right? So the question is, and in fact, you might know that there is a long-standing debate among the rabbis in the Midrash and the Talmud about whether our ancestors actually lived in Sukkot or not. Rabbi Eliezer taught that what's mentioned here in our pasuk, in our verse, is what he calls Sukkot Mamash, that they actually lived in real Sukkot, just like the type of Sukkot that we built for ourselves, with thatched roofs of bamboo, or they didn't have bamboo then, but leaves and branches and other living materials. Whereas Rabbi Akiva, the famous Rabbi Akiva, teaches that the Sukkot that we're referring to were symbolic. They didn't live in Sukkot at all. This is a symbol of Ananei Kavod, the divine clouds of glory that protected our ancestors during their 40 years in the desert. So these are two very different ideas. The sukkah itself is humble, fragile, and temporary, whereas if you think of God's clouds of glory, we're talking about something majestic, perhaps radiance, something divine. Very different than our humble little sukkah that we're talking about. The most significant time that a cloud appears in the Torah describes the Mishkan, the portable desert sanctuary that our ancestors built, the tabernacle, the hut in the desert, that our ancestors built as God's home in their midst. And here is how the tabernacle, the Mishkan, is described in the Torah. The cloud covered the tent of meeting. The glory of God filled the tabernacle. Sounds a little bit perhaps like Rabbi Akiva's version, perhaps, of the clouds of glory. The roof of a sukkah is called schach, right? From the word which means to cover, and that's where the word sukkah comes from. Do you know where the only place in the Torah we have a word that comes from the same root as schach is? When we refer to the Mishkan, to the tabernacle, 2 things have inside of it have the same word used as schach or sukkah, the parochet, the curtain that was within the Mishkan that divided the Holy of Holies from the rest of the tabernacle, and on top of the Aron HaKodesh, the Holy Ark, the Ark of the Covenant, there were 2 cherubs, and there it says the cover, schach, is where God resided. So there is some integral connection between the Mishkan, the portable tabernacle in the desert, perhaps, and a sukkah. The Mishkan, of course, was portable. It was built with a wooden frame. It had fabric covers that were dismantled and reassembled by a team of Levites. It was small, fragile, and movable. By the way, this is in stark contrast to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, the Beit HaMikdash, which King Solomon built, which was permanent, unmovable, grand, majestic, and made of stone. So, Rabbi Nathan Laufer, in his book, Rendezvous with God, revealing the meaning of the Jewish holidays and their mysterious rituals, looks closely at the biblical narrative to give us a deeper understanding of why we build and why we dwell in a sukkah. According to tradition, what happened on the first Yom Kippur? Anyone? What happened on Yom Kippur in biblical times? The first Yom Kippur. Anyone know? Okay, but even before that, right? What Ruth is telling us, what the Torah prescribes us to do, which is to afflict ourselves, and that's why we fast. But if you actually look, on the 10th of Tishrei, something historically happened to the Jewish people. Yes, someone said that's when Moses smashed the set of 10 Commandments, the tablets. Not exactly, it's close, related. On Yom Kippur, well, let's back up for a second. After Moses comes down, after the first 40 days, right, on Shavuot, that's when Moses goes up to begin the 40 days. It's actually a 120-day cycle if you want to go through the Jewish calendar. 40 days, Moses goes up, and then on the 40th day, the golden calf is built. Moses comes down, sees the golden calf, and smashes the first set of tablets, the 10 Commandments, that God gave to Moses. And God is incensed and angry. And for 40 days, the people and Moses beg for forgiveness. And after 40 days, on the first day of Elul, God tells Moses to come back up the mountain, but to bring something with Moses. What does Moses bring? Right? Moses hews out of stone blank tablets and brings blank tablets up. And for 40 days and 40 nights, the 30 days of Elul and the first 10 days of Tishrei, God gives Moses and inscribes on the second set that was carved by humanity, the 10 Commandments. And on day 40, which is Yom Kippur, at the end of the day, when it would be our Ne'ilah, and the shofar blast, Moses comes down with the second set of tablets, which are a symbol that God has forgiven our ancestors. So, after all that, what's the next thing that happens in the Torah? After Moses comes down with the second set of tablets. Anyone know? Not complaining, not Parshat Truma. What's the next thing that happens? No. Right after Moses comes down with the second set of tablets, if you look, it's the end of Kitisa, actually. Then the Jewish people begin on a sacred building project. When Moses comes down, the very next thing, on the very next day, Moses assembles the people and instructs them to donate to a national construction project to build the Mishkan. The Midrash says that God gave this instruction to Moses on Yom Kippur Day atop Mount Sinai. Immediately that next day, the people generously contributed their material goods, fabric, thread, wood, oil, whatever their heart moved them, and within days, the sacred building project began. Clearly not on today's building schedule. The entire construction project lasted only 6 months. It was consecrated in the month of Nisan and Pesach. As the materials began to be collected, the Israelites started their construction within days, because as the Midrash says, they were bechadva ubesimcha. They were filled with a feeling of joy and gladness, a renewed sense of purpose. Having been forgiven by God, they were uplifted. So here's the question. If we're suggesting, or I'm suggesting, that the sukkah is a remembrance of the Mishkan, the desert tabernacle, the portable home for God, God's sukkah, and God's dwelling presence among the people, when did God's cloud of glory first fill the Mishkan? It was constructed, dedicated, and begun its service on Pesach. Then why are we celebrating it on Sukkot? Because the rabbi known as the Vilna Gaon taught that on the 15th day of Tishrei, the first day of Sukkot. It was the first day that the Israelites actually began construction. That's when they began building the Mishkan, just 4 days after their initial instructions. And from that moment, the first nail that was put into the wood to begin building the Mishkan, God's presence was once again felt among the people, and God returned to dwell among them. And it's the same for us. We have done our building project internally on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And now we do our external, physical construction project. After Ne'ilah and breakfast, just after Yom Kippur, we are filled with a sense of divine purpose, b'chadva u'b'simcha, with joy and with gladness. When we build our sukkah, we remember the ancient Israelite building project of the Mishkan that we are reenacting each and every year. And if we look at the detailed building instructions that take up 4 whole parshiot in our Torah, chapter after chapter, we find that the Mishkan was built 20 cubits high. And do you know what the law is, the requirement, the maximum height requirement for a sukkah? 20 cubits high. And if you look at the minimum height for a sukkah, the smallest sukkah has to be at least 10 handbreadths. And if you look at the Mishkan, the Ark of the Covenant, right on top of it, the minimum height for the Ark had to be 10 handbreadths high, and God's presence dwelled right above the Ark. So there are more and more similarities and parallelisms between the Sukkah and the Mishkan. If we go back to that traditional disagreement between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva about Sukkot, were there really Sukkot in ancient times? The answer is they were both right. The ancient Israelites either lived in Sukkot or ancestors built a sukkah for God that was filled with cloud of glory. Both were temporary, both were movable, because we are a people that's continually moving, transforming, evolving, building and rebuilding, growing and learning. As Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory writes, a people that never stops traveling, spiritually if not physically, will never grow old. In Tishrei, we began our cycle of Rosh Hashanah, of building and creating. Our new year celebrates God creating the world. God built a house for us. The universe is the space which God makes for us. On Sukkot, with our sukkah, its incomplete roof, our door open to strangers, that's the space we make for God and our community, in our lives and our world. May our sukkah shelter us and surround us with meaning. And when we sit in our sukkah, our shelter of faith, may we feel ourselves surrounded by God's presence, God's cloud of glory. We remember today that the humblest of building projects can truly be the greatest. Chag Sameach.